Hey everyone, and welcome back to your daily dose of what's hot on Hacker News. Yesterday was quite the day. We sifted through 22 stories to bring you the top 5 that really got the community talking. And wow, do we have an eclectic mix for you today. We're diving into everything from groundbreaking web gaming that's making people question what browsers can really do, to heated debates about replacing 40-year-old academic tools, and even a fascinating discussion about why Greenland might be the most misunderstood place on Earth. Plus, we've got some controversy brewing over a project that dares to call itself SSH3. And we'll wrap up with a nostalgic trip through electronic music history that's been keeping the internet weird for over 2 decades. So, buckle up. This is what had Hacker News buzzing yesterday. All right, switching gears completely here, let's talk about a WebGL game where you deliver messages on a tiny planet. And wow, this one really caught the Hacker News community's attention with over 1,000 points and almost 200 comments. You know what's wild? We've all gotten so used to WebGL being this sort of, adequate technology for browser games, right? It works, but you always expect some jankiness, especially on mobile. Well, this little game is absolutely shattering those expectations. People in the comments are genuinely shocked at how smooth this thing runs. One user said they've never seen WebGL perform this well on their phone, and honestly, that's saying something in 2024. So here's the concept. You're on this tiny spherical planet delivering messages to other players. Think of it like if Animal Crossing had a baby with Journey, and then that baby learned to run in a web browser. The whole aesthetic is apparently just gorgeous. Users are comparing it to that game company's work, the folks behind Journey and Sky. And that's high praise because those games are basically the gold standard for atmospheric, emotionally resonant design. What's fascinating is how many people admitted they just forgot to actually play the game. They got so caught up in exploring this tiny world, listening to the ambient sounds, watching the day-night cycle, that delivering messages became secondary. One commenter said they spent 20 minutes just running around, completely mesmerized by the atmosphere. When's the last time a browser game made you forget you were supposed to be doing something? The technical achievement here is really something special. We're talking about a multiplayer experience with real-time interactions, beautiful graphics, smooth animations, all running in your browser without any downloads or installations, on mobile. Remember when we used to have to install Unity Web Player just to play basic 3D games online? This is running on phones that people are describing as old or underpowered, and it's still buttery smooth. But, and there's always a but, right? The camera controls are apparently driving some people absolutely nuts. Multiple users are reporting issues, especially on iOS, where the camera seems to have its own mind. One person compared it to a bad PC port of Sonic Adventure, which, ouch, that's a very specific burn. The camera's too close to the character for some, randomly rotating for others, and a few people even reported motion sickness from the narrow field of view combined with the hilly terrain. It's interesting, though, even the people complaining about the controls still seem impressed by everything else. It's like, imagine going to a restaurant where the food is absolutely incredible, but they only give you chopsticks made of wet noodles. You're frustrated, but you can't help appreciating the chef's skill, The multiplayer aspect seems really thoughtfully done, too. It's not competitive, it's not stressful, you're just sharing this tiny planet with other people, delivering their messages, creating these little moments of connection. In an era where every online game wants to be an esport or a battle royale, there's something refreshing about a game that just wants you to vibe, basically. What really strikes me about the community reaction is this sense of genuine surprise and delight. We've gotten so cynical about web-based games, expecting them to be inferior versions of real games. But this little messenger game is proof that the platform's limitations might actually be more about our expectations than actual technical barriers. When someone puts in the effort, When they really optimize and polish, a browser game can be just as immersive and beautiful as anything you download from Steam. Though I do hope they fix those camera controls, because it sounds like they're the only thing standing between this game and absolute perfection. Speaking of technical achievements that are challenging long-held assumptions, let's talk about something that's been frustrating academics and technical writers since before that WebGL game's developers were probably even born. Typst, a possible LaTeX replacement. All right, so our next story touches on something that's been a thorn in the side of academics and technical writers for, well, decades, really. We're talking about Typst, a possible LaTeX replacement. And wow, did this one strike a nerve on Hacker News with 660 points and over 300 comments. Now, if you've never wrestled with LaTeX before, consider yourself lucky. It's this document typesetting system that's been around since the 1980s, actually predates Linux, and it's basically been the undisputed champion for writing academic papers, especially in math, physics, and computer science. The output is gorgeous, absolutely publication quality stuff. But using it, that's where things get interesting. So enter Typst, this new challenger, written in Rust, that's promising to give us all the beautiful typesetting we love from LaTeX without the, let's call them, character-building experiences that LaTeX is famous for. And the community response has been fascinating. It's overwhelmingly positive, which honestly surprised me given how entrenched LaTeX is in academia. What really caught my eye in the discussion was this production use case someone shared. They're generating 2,000-plus page documents, and with LaTeX, it was taking 18 minutes to compile. With Typst, 1 minute. That's not just an incremental improvement, that's a complete game changer for anyone working on large documents. We're talking about going from, let me grab a coffee while this compiles, to, oh, it's already done. But here's what I think is really compelling about this whole situation. LaTeX has been this incredible free software success story, right? It's been the gold standard for decades, powering countless research papers and textbooks. Yet everyone who uses it has this love-hate relationship with it. The installation size is massive. We're talking gigabytes. The error messages are cryptic enough to make grown PhD students cry. And if you want to customize anything beyond the basics, you better be ready to learn what feels like an entirely different programming language based on macros from the 1970s. The Rust angle is interesting too. We're seeing this pattern across the industry where foundational tools are being rewritten in memory-safe languages. It's not just about preventing crashes, it's about building something maintainable and fast from the ground up without carrying 40 years of technical debt. Now, the discussion on Hacker News revealed some really practical insights. People who've actually made the switch are reporting that Typst error messages are, get this, actually helpful. Like, they tell you what's wrong and where. Revolutionary concept, I know. The syntax is cleaner, more intuitive. One user mentioned they could write custom solutions quickly without worrying about package conflicts, which, if you've ever spent 3 hours debugging why 2 LaTeX packages don't play nice together, you know that's huge. But, and this is a big but, there's the ecosystem problem. LaTeX has 40 years of packages, templates, and solutions for every edge case imaginable. More importantly, and this came up repeatedly in the discussion, academic publishers and conferences all expect LaTeX submissions. Until Nature, IEEE, ACM, and the rest start accepting Typst templates, researchers are kind of stuck. It's the classic chicken and egg problem. Publishers won't support it until researchers use it. Researchers can't use it until publishers support it. There was this interesting contrarian view in the comments, though. One user argued that the problem isn't text itself, but LaTeX specifically. They claim plain text is actually simpler and more controllable. It's a fair point. Sometimes the abstraction layer is what makes things complicated, not the underlying technology. What strikes me most about this whole discussion is what it says about software longevity and the cost of switching. LaTeX works. It's battle-tested, it's universal in certain fields, and despite all the complaints, millions of documents have been successfully created with it. But at what point do the accumulated frustrations outweigh the switching costs? When does good enough stop being good enough? The fact that Typst is Apache 2.0 licensed and already seeing production use suggests this might not just be another LaTeX killer that fades away. The speed improvements alone, 3 to 4 times faster compilation being typical, could be enough to drive adoption in environments where time really is money. And for new users just starting out, well, if you had the choice between learning LaTeX or learning something designed this century with actual user experience in mind, I know which one I'd pick. The real test will be whether Typst can build that critical mass of users and packages to become self-sustaining. Because at the end of the day, the best typesetting system is the one that actually lets you focus on your content instead of fighting with the tools. And from what the Hacker News community is saying, Typst might just be getting us closer to that ideal. Now, let's pivot slightly. Speaking of tools and environments that can be both beautiful and frustrating at the same time, that brings us to something completely unexpected that captured the community's imagination yesterday. So, here's something completely different from our tech discussions. Our next story is Greenland is a beautiful nightmare. And wow, did this one strike a nerve with the Hacker News crowd. Sometimes the best conversations on HN aren't about the latest JavaScript framework or AI breakthrough. They're about these deeply human experiences that somehow resonate with our community of builders and thinkers. Now, I'll be honest, we couldn't actually access the original article. Seems like it might have gotten the hug of the death or something, but the discussion thread itself tells such a fascinating story. The article apparently takes this kind of cynical, almost dismissive tone about Greenland, describing it as harsh and unwelcoming. But then you dive into the comments and it's like entering a completely different world. What really caught my eye was how many people push back against this negativity. There's this user, McKnight, who just goes off about how the author apparently described glaciers as dumb rivers of ice or something equally reductive. And they're like, no, these are magnificent, living geological features that have shaped our planet for millennia. The passion in that response, you can feel it through the screen. But here's where it gets really interesting. The comment section turned into this beautiful collection of people sharing their own experiences in these remote, harsh environments. And the common thread, it's not that these places are nightmares at all. It's that they're transformative. Multiple commenters describe this feeling of being simultaneously insignificant and deeply calm when faced with the raw power of Arctic nature. One person talked about standing on a glacier in Greenland and feeling this profound sense of, I guess you'd call it right-sizing, like suddenly understanding your actual place in the universe. There's this wonderful comment from someone who actually lived in Greenland, and they're talking about the local Inuit culture, the incredible natural phenomena, the way the landscape changes with the seasons. They describe watching icebergs calve from glaciers, the northern lights dancing overhead, the absolute silence that you can only find in places that remote. And you realize, reading this, that the nightmare part of the title might be the author's problem, not Greenland's. What's fascinating from a tech community perspective is how many of our people have actually spent time in these extreme environments. We had folks chiming in who'd worked on research stations, done software contracts in remote locations, even someone who'd been part of scientific expeditions. And they all seem to share this view that, yeah, it's harsh, it's challenging, but it's also profoundly beautiful and life-changing. One commenter, I love this, suggested half-jokingly that maybe the author was being deliberately negative to keep people away, like when locals tell tourists the weather's always terrible to preserve their secret paradise. And honestly, given how the comment thread reads like a love letter to Greenland, that theory doesn't seem so far-fetched. The discussion also touched on something deeper about how we modern humans interact with truly wild places. Several people noted that experiencing that kind of raw, indifferent nature, where you're not the apex predator, where the environment could kill you without malice or notice, it recalibrates something fundamental in your psyche. One person described it as finally understanding what sublime actually means. Not just beautiful, but beautiful in a way that includes terror and awe. And you know what really stands out? The contrast between what seems to be the article's cynicism and the commenter's almost spiritual appreciation for these experiences. It's like the author went to Greenland expecting Instagram moments and found reality instead, while the commenters understand that the nightmare aspects, the isolation, the harsh weather, the indifference of nature, those are the beauty. They're inseparable. There's this great bit where someone talks about the practicalities too, how expensive it is to get there, how limited the infrastructure is, and how you really need to prepare both physically and mentally for that kind of environment. But even those warnings come with this undertone of, and it's absolutely worth it. The whole thread kind of makes you want to book a flight to Nook immediately, despite, or maybe because of, all the warnings about frozen harbors and -40 temperatures and months of darkness. It's this reminder that sometimes the most profound experiences come from stepping way outside our comfort zones, away from our screens in climate-controlled environments, into places that remind us we're just temporary guests on this planet. Now, speaking of stepping outside comfort zones and challenging established ways of doing things, let's get back to the technical realm with a project that's trying to revolutionize one of the most fundamental tools in system administration. SSH3, faster and rich secure shell using HTTP3. All right, so our next story has the community pretty fired up, and it's about SSH3, which promises to be a faster and richer secure shell using HTTP/3. And I've got to say, this one's stirring up quite the debate, with 368 points and over 200 comments on Hacker News. So here's the thing. SSH3 isn't actually SSH at all. It's more like someone took the concept of remote terminal access and completely rebuilt it from scratch on top of HTTP/3 and quick. The creators are claiming some pretty impressive performance gains. We're talking about cutting connection establishment from 5 to 7 round trips down to just 3. That's actually significant if you're constantly connecting to servers throughout your day. But here's where it gets interesting and honestly a bit controversial. The developers themselves are already backing away from the SSH3 name. They're admitting that what they've built is so fundamentally different from traditional SSH that it can't be integrated into existing implementations. They're even considering rebranding it to Remote Terminals over HTTP/3, which, let's be honest, doesn't quite roll off the tongue the same way. The technical approach is fascinating, though. By building on Quick and HTTP/3, they're getting some modern features basically for free. Things like connection migration, where your session can seamlessly move between networks, and built-in multiplexing. Plus, they've added OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect authentication, which could be a game changer for enterprise environments that are already deep into those ecosystems. There's also this claim about making servers invisible to port scanning attacks, and the community is definitely divided on this one. Some folks see it as a legitimate security feature. You can't attack what you can't find, right? But others are pointing out that this same feature could be used to hide malicious infrastructure. It's that classic security double-edged sword we see so often. Now, the Hacker News discussion is where things get really spicy. There's this growing discomfort with what people are calling the HTTPification of everything. It's like every protocol these days is being re-implemented on top of HTTP. We've got DNS over HTTPS, now SSH over HTTPS3, and people are asking, where does it end? Are we just going to tunnel everything through port 443 until that's the only port that exists on the internet? The performance claims are also being scrutinized pretty heavily. Sure, connection establishment is faster, but as several commenters pointed out, that's not usually the bottleneck people care about. Once you're connected, keystroke latency is what matters for interactive sessions, and SSH3 doesn't really address that. Plus, if you're using SSH connection multiplexing or keeping persistent connections, you're already avoiding most of those round trips anyway. What's really telling is that the project seems to have stalled out. No commits in over a year, which, for something trying to replace one of the most fundamental tools in system administration, that's not a great sign. It feels like one of those projects that had a burst of enthusiasm, hit some fundamental roadblocks, and then quietly faded. There was one interesting defender in the comments, though. Someone pointed out that being written in Go gives it inherent memory safety advantages over traditional C-based SSH implementations. And you know what? That's actually a fair point. We've seen enough open SSH vulnerabilities over the years that a memory-safe alternative could have value, even if it's architecturally different. But I think the naming controversy really highlights a broader issue in tech. When you call something SSH3, you're setting expectations. People expect evolution, not revolution. It's like if I told you about a new car called the Bicycle 3.0, but it had 4 wheels and an engine, you'd rightfully be confused. The developers seem to realize this now, but it might be too late to shake that initial impression. The whole thing reminds me of other ambitious protocol replacements we've seen over the years. Remember when everyone was going to switch from email to Wave? Or when SPDY was going to replace HTTP before it basically just became HTTP2? Sometimes the boring, battle-tested solution wins, not because it's the best, but because it's good enough, and everyone already knows how to use it. And speaking of things that have stood the test of time against all odds, let's wrap up with something that's been a cornerstone of internet culture for over 2 decades. Story 5, Ishkur's Guide to Electronic Music. All right, now we're diving into something that's got the Hacker News crowd feeling seriously nostalgic. Ishkur's Guide to Electronic Music. This is one of those internet treasures that's been around for, get this, over 25 years, and it's still going strong. So here's what's fascinating about this. We're talking about a comprehensive interactive guide to electronic music that started back in the Flash era of the web. Remember Flash? Yeah, that thing that Steve Jobs basically killed off. But Ishkur's Guide survived that extinction event and successfully migrated to modern web technologies, which is honestly pretty remarkable when you think about how many Flash-based sites just disappeared into the digital void. What really struck me reading through the comments is how deeply personal this site is for so many people. You've got folks saying things like, I spent countless hours exploring this in high school, and this is how I discovered entire genres of music. It's this perfect example of what we call the old internet. You know, when individual creators would pour their hearts into these massive passion projects, creating these incredibly detailed resources just because they loved something. And here's the thing that makes Ishkur's Guide special. It's not trying to be Wikipedia. The creator, Ishkur, brings this wonderfully opinionated, sometimes sarcastic, occasionally spiteful commentary to each genre description. One commenter described it perfectly. They said it's refreshing compared to the neutral, sanitized music resources we usually get today. Like, where else are you going to find a music guide that'll straight up roast certain subgenres while teaching you about BPM ranges and the evolution of synthesizer sounds? Now, not everyone's completely on board with how the guide presents things. There's this interesting debate in the comments about whether the genre evolution lines actually make sense. One user, goes by DFD'd Beef, makes this compelling argument that the guide should really be organized around hardware releases instead. They're saying, look, the release of the TR-808 and TR-908 drum machines had way more impact on how genres developed than this organic evolution story the guide tells. And honestly, they might have a point. The sound of electronic music has always been deeply tied to the tools available at the time. But here's what I love about this whole discussion. It shows how much people still care about understanding and documenting electronic music history. You've got suggestions for improvements flying around. People want better search functionality. They want to see more recent genres added. They want the ability to create custom paths through the genre maze. It's like this 25-year-old website has become this living document that the community wants to keep evolving.
And can we just appreciate for a second that this thing has survived multiple decades of internet evolution? We're living in an era where websites pivot every 2 years or get acqui-hired and shut down. And here's Ishkur, still maintaining this massive interactive guide about the difference between deep house and tech house, still explaining why drum and bass split off from jungle in the mid-90s. The nostalgia factor here is real, but it's not just empty nostalgia. This represents something we've kind of lost. These deeply personal, obsessively detailed web projects created by individuals who just wanted to share their knowledge. No monetization strategy, no growth hacking, no engagement metrics, just someone who really, really loves electronic music and wants you to understand why UK Garage is actually its own thing and not just a house variant. It makes you wonder what the modern equivalent would even look like, you know? Could something like this even exist if it started today? Or would it immediately get buried under SEO-optimized content farms and YouTube explainer videos? The fact that it's still here, still being discovered by new generations of electronic music fans, that's pretty special. And that's a wrap on yesterday's top stories from Hacker News. What a journey, right? From pushing the boundaries of what's possible in a web browser to challenging decades-old academic tools, from the harsh beauty of the Arctic to the ongoing evolution of fundamental internet protocols, and finally to a piece of internet history that refuses to die. What really strikes me about today's collection is how they all, in different ways, challenge our assumptions, whether it's what a browser can do, what tools we should use, what places are worth visiting, or what the internet should look like. These stories remind us that there's always room to question the status quo. Out of 22 stories that hit Hacker News yesterday, these 5 sparked the most passionate discussions, the most thoughtful debates, and, honestly, the most interesting tangents. And that's what makes this community special. It's not just about the tech, it's about the humans using it, creating it, and sometimes escaping from it to frozen Nordic territories. Thanks for tuning in to your daily Hacker News Roundup. Keep building, keep questioning, and we'll see you tomorrow with another batch of stories that get the community talking. Until then, this has been your window into what made Hacker News tick yesterday.